Every year, you fill out tax forms, calculate what you owe, and watch money leave your account for the government. You see the deductions, understand the rates, and accept that taxation is the price of civilization even if you disagree about how much or how it's spent. But there's another tax you're paying, one that never appears on any form, never gets debated in Congress, and never shows up as a line item in your bank statement. It's called inflation, and it's the most effective, most regressive, and most politically convenient tax ever devised. While you're focused on income tax rates and deductions, inflation is silently extracting wealth from your savings, your paycheck, your retirement accounts, and every dollar you own. It's a tax that compounds daily, that you can't avoid through deductions or credits, and that falls hardest on the people least able to bear it: the poor, the elderly, the middle class struggling to build wealth. Understanding how inflation functions as a tax means recognizing that the 2% inflation target the Federal Reserve announces proudly isn't price stability. It's a commitment to continuously reduce the value of your money by 2% every year, to transfer wealth from everyone who holds dollars to the government that issues them, and to the financial institutions closest to money creation. The silent tax stealing your wealth isn't a conspiracy theory or a fringe economic argument. It's established monetary policy, openly acknowledged by central banks, and it's costing you far more than your income tax ever will. The mechanics of inflation as taxation begin with understanding what inflation actually is and how it's created. In the simplest terms, inflation is an increase in the general price level of goods and services over time. When inflation runs at 3%, on average, things cost 3% more this year than last year. But this definition obscures the cause. Inflation doesn't happen spontaneously or through natural economic forces beyond human control. It happens because the money supply grows faster than the economy's productive capacity. When there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, prices rise. And who controls the money supply? Central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve in the United States, which has the power to create money from nothing through various mechanisms including buying government bonds and lending to banks. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, which it has done for decades, it must borrow the difference by issuing treasury bonds. Historically, those bonds were purchased by private investors using actual savings. But increasingly, especially since 2008 and dramatically during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve has purchased enormous quantities of treasury bonds using money it creates electronically. This is called monetizing the debt, and it's functionally identical to printing money to pay government bills. The newly created money enters the economy, increasing the money supply, and eventually causes prices to rise as that money works through the system. This is taxation through inflation. The government gets real resources, labor, materials, services, paid for with newly created money. But that money creation dilutes everyone else's dollars, reducing their purchasing power. The inflation that results is effectively a transfer of wealth from everyone holding dollars to the government, spending those newly created dollars before prices rise. It's a hidden tax because most people don't see the connection between government spending, money creation, and the rising prices they experience years later. They blame businesses, supply chains, or vague economic forces rather than recognizing that inflation is the inevitable consequence of creating money faster than the economy grows. The scale of this hidden tax is staggering. From 2020 to 2023, the US experienced inflation that peaked at 9.1% and averaged well above the Fed's 2% target. Someone with $100,000 in savings at the start of 2020 found that money could buy roughly what $75,000 could buy by the end of 2023, a loss of $25,000 in purchasing power. That's a 25% tax on savings, extracted not through any legislative process, but through monetary policy that expanded the money supply to finance pandemic spending and economic stimulus. The government got trillions to spend. Savers lost trillions in purchasing power. The transfer was direct, massive, and almost completely invisible to those paying it. But inflation functions as a tax through multiple channels beyond just the direct erosion of purchasing power. One of the most insidious is bracket creep, where inflation pushes taxpayers into higher tax brackets even though their real income, adjusted for inflation, hasn't increased. Imagine you earn $50,000 per year. Inflation runs at 4%, and your employer gives you a 4% raise to keep pace. Your nominal income rises to $52,000, but your purchasing power is unchanged. You can buy the same amount as before. But tax brackets aren't always adjusted for inflation, and even when they are, there are lags and imperfections. If the tax threshold for a higher bracket is $51,000, your raise just pushed you into that higher bracket. You're now paying a higher marginal tax rate on income that buys no more than it did before the raise. Inflation has increased your tax burden without Congress passing any new tax legislation. At the federal level, the IRS adjusts tax brackets annually for inflation, but even these adjustments lag reality and use measures that may not reflect your actual cost increases. And crucially, many states don't index their tax systems to inflation at all. New York State, for example, hasn't implemented automatic tax indexation since 2016, meaning that 8 years of inflation have pushed taxpayers into higher brackets and eroded the real value of deductions without any legislative approval. Research shows that from 2016 to 2023, a single filer earning $25,000 lost a cumulative $270 due to bracket creep in New York alone. That might not sound like much, but for someone earning $25,000, losing $270 is more than 1% of annual income, a significant burden for someone already struggling. The effect is worse for middle-income households who see their nominal incomes rise with inflation but find themselves paying higher effective tax rates as bracket creep moves them into higher brackets. A family earning $75,000 in 2016 might have faced a 20% marginal tax rate. By 2023, if their income rose to $90,000 just to keep pace with inflation, they might face a 24% marginal rate. Their purchasing power is unchanged, but their tax burden increased by 4 percentage points purely as a result of inflation interacting with an unindexed tax system. Economist Lawrence Kotlikoff describes this as like a permanent tax hike that operates invisibly. Capital gains taxation demonstrates another channel through which inflation functions as a hidden tax, and this one hits hardest at those trying to build wealth. Capital gains are taxed based on nominal gains, not real inflation-adjusted gains. If you bought a stock for $100,000 in 2000 and sold it for $200,000 in 2025, you'd owe capital gains tax on the $100,000 gain. But inflation over that period was roughly 75%, meaning your $200,000 in 2025 buys what $114,000 bought in 2000. Your real inflation-adjusted gain was only $15,000, but you're taxed as if you gained $100,000. The government taxes you on $86,000 in phantom gains that exist only because of inflation that the government itself created through monetary policy. This phantom gain taxation applies to all long-term investments. Bonds that mature after decades, real estate held for years, businesses built over lifetimes, all face taxation on gains that may be entirely or largely illusory after adjusting for inflation. The homeowner tax exclusion, which allows singles to exclude $250,000 and married couples $500,000 in home value appreciation from capital gains taxation, hasn't been adjusted since 1997. Consumer prices have nearly doubled since then, meaning the real value of those exclusions has been cut in half. A couple who bought a house for $200,000 in 1997 and sold it for $700,000 in 2025 appears to have gained $500,000, exactly at the exclusion limit. But adjusted for inflation, that house's purchase price in 2025 was $390,000, and the sale price of $700,000 represents a real gain of $310,000. They're being taxed on gains that don't exist after accounting for inflation. Wealthy households that hold substantial investment portfolios face massive inflation tax burdens through this mechanism. But middle-class families trying to build wealth through homeownership or modest stock portfolios get hit proportionally harder because inflation eats a larger percentage of their gains. Someone with $1 million in assets earning 7% returns sees $70,000 in nominal gains annually. At 3% inflation, $30,000 of that is phantom gain just keeping pace with inflation, but they're taxed on the full $70,000, meaning the inflation tax takes roughly $7,500 in federal capital gains tax on illusory gains, assuming a 25% rate. That's a hidden tax of 1.75% on their entire portfolio annually, imposed not through legislation but through the interaction of inflation and nominal taxation. The effect on retirement savings is particularly cruel. Someone who saves diligently for 40 years, building a $500,000 nest egg through stocks and bonds held in taxable accounts, faces capital gains taxation on all the appreciation. If that account grew from $100,000 in contributions to $500,000 over 40 years, there's $400,000 in nominal gains, but most of that gain just keeps pace with inflation over 4 decades. the real inflation-adjusted value might have increased from $100,000 to only $200,000 in constant dollars. The retiree faces capital gains tax on $400,000, even though their real wealth increased by only $100,000. 3/4 of their tax burden is on phantom inflation gains. Social Security recipients face inflation taxation through lags and imperfect adjustments and cost of living adjustments, or COLAs. While Social Security benefits are adjusted annually for inflation, the adjustments lag actual price increases and use inflation measures that may not reflect retirees' actual costs. Healthcare, which dominates elderly spending, inflates faster than the general CPI that determines COLA adjustments. Research found that persistent 4% inflation effectively reduces Social Security benefits by about 2% in real terms. If inflation surged to 10% and remained there, Social Security benefits would effectively decline by 5%. Retirees on fixed incomes watch their purchasing power erode continuously despite nominal COLAs because the adjustments never quite keep pace with their actual cost increases. Tax credits and deductions that aren't indexed to inflation lose real value continuously, functioning as stealth tax increases. The child tax credit, which provides significant tax relief to families with children, has lost 25% of its real value from 2003 to 2017 and lost another 15% from 2018 to early 2023. A credit worth $1,000 annually loses purchasing power every year, meaning it compensates for less and less of the actual cost of raising children. The government effectively increases taxes on families by allowing inflation to erode the credit's value without any legislative vote or public debate. Lower-income households suffer disproportionately from inflation taxation because they hold more of their limited wealth in cash and receive more of their income from wages that lag inflation. Research shows that lower-income taxpayers lose proportionally more from unindexed tax systems because they depend heavily on credits and deductions that lose value to inflation. A household earning $25,000 annually might receive $3,000 in various tax credits. If those credits lose 15% of their real value over several years, that household loses $450 in real terms, almost 2% of their annual income. Meanwhile, a wealthy household earning $2,000 to $50,000 with minimal credits loses almost nothing to credit erosion. The poor also hold assets primarily in cash rather than stocks, real estate, or other investments that appreciate with or ahead of inflation. A low-income family with $5,000 in emergency savings sees that money lose $150 annually to 3% inflation. That represents 3% of their total savings. A wealthy family with $5 million in stocks sees those stocks appreciate at 7% annually, gaining $350,000 while inflation erodes cash by only 3%, a net real gain of 4% or $200,000. The inflation tax takes $150 from the poor family and gives them nothing, while the wealthy family's assets appreciate faster than inflation erodes them. This is why economist Parker Shepard notes that lower-income Americans suffer greater inflation penalties than wealthier Americans. The political convenience of inflation taxation explains why governments and central banks perpetuate it despite the damage. Raising explicit taxes requires legislative action, public debate, and voter approval. Politicians face electoral consequences for raising taxes, but inflation requires no legislation, no debate, and no explicit approval. The Federal Reserve, an institution insulated from direct democratic accountability, can create inflation through monetary policy without any politician casting a vote or facing voters angry about tax increases. By the time the inflation appears, often years after the monetary expansion that caused it, the causal connection is obscured and voters blame businesses, supply chains, or vague economic forces rather than the monetary policy that created the problem. Government benefits enormously from inflation in multiple ways beyond the direct transfer from expanding the money supply. Inflation reduces the real burden of government debt. The U.S. government owes over $36 trillion, mostly in nominal bonds that pay fixed dollar amounts. As inflation erodes the value of the dollar, the real burden of that debt declines. $1 trillion in bonds issued in 2020 must be repaid with dollars that will be worth less in 2030 and far less in 2040. The government borrows in today's dollars and repays in tomorrow's depreciated dollars, effectively defaulting on part of the debt through inflation rather than through explicit default. This is politically convenient because bondholders receive the nominal amount promised, so there's no visible default, but they're paid in dollars worth far less than when they lent them. Inflation also pushes taxpayers into higher brackets through bracket creep, as discussed earlier, increasing tax revenues without legislation. And it erodes the real value of government obligations like Social Security and fixed government salaries, allowing government to pay workers less in real terms without cutting nominal pay and facing the political backlash that explicit cuts would trigger. For a government drowning in debt and facing impossible fiscal constraints, inflation is the perfect escape valve. It reduces real spending obligations, increases real tax revenues, and decreases the real debt burden, all without any explicit policy change that voters could organize against. This is why Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and other central bankers speak of 2% inflation as if it's a feature rather than a bug, a target to be achieved rather than a problem to be solved. The 2% target was formalized in 2012, but represents informal policy dating back decades. It's presented as necessary for economic stability, preventing the supposed dangers of deflation while keeping inflation low enough not to be destabilizing. But the real function is providing a continuous wealth transfer from the public to the government and from savers to borrowers, allowing government debt to be serviced in depreciated currency and ensuring that holding cash is always a losing proposition that forces people into financial markets where volatility and risk create opportunities for sophisticated investors while destroying unsophisticated savers. The compounding effect of sustained inflation makes the long-term wealth destruction catastrophic even at rates considered moderate by central bankers. At 2% inflation, money loses half its value every 35 years. At 3%, every 24 years. At 4%, every 18 years. Someone who saves $100,000 at age 30 and holds it in cash or low-yielding safe investments until retirement at 65 will find that money buys what $35,000 bought when they saved it, assuming 3% average inflation. They lost $65,000 in purchasing power, a 65% tax on their savings, paid not through any explicit policy but through the cumulative effect of monetary expansion sustained over decades. The wealth transfer from this sustained inflation is staggering when aggregated across the economy. U.S. household net worth is approximately $160 trillion. A 3% annual erosion of purchasing power represents $4.8 trillion annually in real wealth destruction. Where does that wealth go? It's transferred to whoever receives and spends the newly created money first, before prices rise. Government gets real resources paid for with money created from nothing. Banks that receive newly created reserves from the Federal Reserve can lend that money before inflation increases, profiting from the spread. Financial institutions closest to money creation benefit while those furthest from it, ordinary workers and savers, lose purchasing power. This pattern is called the Cantillon Effect, named after 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, who observed that inflation benefits those closest to where money enters the economy and hurts those furthest from it. When the Federal Reserve creates money to buy treasury bonds, that money enters through financial markets and government spending. Asset prices rise first, benefiting the wealthy who own stocks and real estate. Government contractors and programs receive funding in dollars not yet depreciated by inflation. But by the time that money works through the economy to wages and consumer prices, inflation has already started, meaning workers and consumers face rising prices before their incomes rise to compensate. The inflation tax thus redistributes wealth upward, from the poor and middle class who receive money last to the wealthy and politically connected who receive it first. The pandemic stimulus programs demonstrated this dynamic perfectly. The Federal Reserve created roughly $5 trillion through quantitative easing and emergency lending programs from 2020 to 2022. That money flooded into financial markets, driving stock prices to all-time highs and enriching wealthy investors who owned assets. Government spending programs distributed money broadly, but much of that went to large corporations and financial institutions through the Paycheck Protection Program and other business support. By the time inflation appeared in 2021 and surged in 2022, asset owners had already benefited from the appreciation while workers and consumers faced rising prices. The inflation tax took from everyone holding dollars but transferred wealth primarily to those who owned assets that appreciated or received government funds early in the cycle. Historical examples demonstrate how inflation taxation destroys societies when it becomes extreme. Weimar Germany's hyperinflation in 1923 erased the middle class's savings completely, wiping out anyone who held bonds or cash while enriching debtors who could repay mortgages with worthless currency. The social and political consequences included the rise of the Nazi Party. More recently, Venezuela's hyperinflation destroyed an entire nation's savings, reducing the currency to worthlessness and impoverishing millions, while a politically connected elite who could access dollars or move wealth abroad maintained or increased their riches. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, Argentina's repeated inflation crises, and dozens of other examples throughout history show the same pattern. Inflation starts as a convenient way for governments to finance spending without explicit taxation, accelerates as the government becomes addicted to money printing, and eventually destroys the currency and the savings of everyone who trusted it. The United States hasn't experienced hyperinflation, but the mechanism exists and the incentives toward it strengthen every year. The federal debt exceeds $36 trillion and grows by over $1 trillion annually through deficits. Interest payments on the debt now exceed defense spending, consuming hundreds of billions that could otherwise fund programs or reduce the deficit. Political gridlock makes tax increases nearly impossible, and both major parties resist significant spending cuts. The fiscal situation is mathematically unsustainable. At some point, either taxes must rise dramatically, spending must be cut drastically, or the debt must be inflated away through monetary expansion that creates inflation, reducing the real debt burden. The path of least political resistance is inflation. Raise taxes explicitly and face voter backlash. Cut popular programs and face organized opposition from beneficiaries. But inflate the currency and the costs are hidden, distributed across all dollar holders, and obscured by the years-long lag between monetary expansion and rising prices. Every government throughout history facing similar fiscal constraints has chosen inflation. The belief that the US is different, that the Federal Reserve will maintain independence and refuse to monetize unlimited government debt, requires faith in institutions resisting enormous political and fiscal pressure. Even without hyperinflation, persistent 3–4% inflation sustained over decades constitutes massive wealth confiscation. Someone entering the workforce today at age 25 with expectations of retiring at 65 faces 40 years of inflation taxation. At 3% inflation, money loses 70% of its purchasing power over 40 years. Every dollar saved at 25 will buy 30 cents of goods and services at 65. This makes traditional saving nearly impossible as a wealth-building strategy. The only path to preserving wealth is investing in assets that appreciate faster than inflation, but this requires financial literacy, risk tolerance, and often substantial initial capital that many people lack. The inflation tax is also highly regressive, falling harder on the poor than the rich. The wealthy hold assets that appreciate with inflation: stocks, real estate, businesses. The poor hold cash and have limited access to appreciating assets. The wealthy can borrow at rates below inflation, effectively being paid to take debt. The poor pay higher interest rates or lack access to credit entirely. And when inflation surges, the wealthy can hedge through commodities, foreign currency, and sophisticated financial instruments. The poor have no hedges, they just suffer the rising prices directly. Proposals to address inflation as a hidden tax face enormous political obstacles. Returning to a gold standard or other commodity-backed money would eliminate the government's ability to inflate, but would also prevent using monetary expansion to finance spending or respond to crises. Most economists and policymakers consider this trade-off unacceptable despite the damage inflation causes. Requiring balanced budgets would prevent the deficits that drive monetization, but both parties benefit from deficit spending and resist balanced budget requirements. Indexing all taxes, credits, and deductions to inflation would prevent bracket creep and erosion of benefits, and some states have moved toward this, but it also reduces government revenues and makes fiscal problems more transparent. The most realistic solution from an individual perspective is understanding that inflation taxation is permanent policy and adjusting accordingly. Hold minimal cash beyond immediate liquidity needs. Invest in appreciating assets despite the risks. Take on low-interest debt when available, since inflation reduces its real burden over time. And recognize that the traditional advice to save prudently in cash is not just obsolete but actively harmful under a fiat currency system designed to inflate perpetually. The deeper question is whether a monetary system based on continuous inflation is sustainable or just. The Federal Reserve maintains that 2% inflation promotes employment and prevents deflation. But the real effect is a continuous wealth transfer from savers to borrowers, from the unsophisticated to the sophisticated, from ordinary citizens to those closest to money creation. It's a tax that falls hardest on those least able to pay, that compounds silently over decades, and that serves primarily to enable government deficit spending without the political cost of explicit taxation. Every year, Americans file tax returns, calculate their obligations, and send money to the government. They see these taxes, understand them to some degree, and can vote against politicians who raise them. But the inflation tax operates invisibly, imposed by central bankers insulated from democratic accountability, extracting far more wealth from the typical family than their income tax ever will. A family earning $75,000 annually might pay $10,000 in federal income taxes. But if they hold $150,000 in cash savings and retirement accounts, 3% inflation costs them $4,500 annually in purchasing power, $9,000 if inflation runs at 6%. Over a working lifetime, the inflation tax exceeds the income tax by multiples, yet almost no one calculates it, understands it, or organizes politically against it. The silent tax stealing your wealth isn't theoretical or hypothetical. It's operating right now, every day, eroding the value of every dollar you own. The $1,000 in your checking account will buy less tomorrow than today. The $50,000 in your savings account is worth less every month. The retirement account you've spent decades building is losing real value continuously despite investment gains that barely keep pace with inflation. And the government that creates this inflation, that explicitly targets 2% annual currency depreciation, faces no consequences because most people don't understand that inflation is policy, not natural phenomenon, and that the invisible hand destroying their wealth is actually the very visible hand of central banks operating in the open while no one pays attention. Understanding the silent tax means recognizing that your real enemy isn't the income tax system, however flawed. It's the monetary system that continuously creates inflation to finance government spending and reduce government debt burdens, transferring the cost to everyone holding dollars. The tax code at least has nominal democratic accountability, legislators who face voters and can be thrown out. The inflation tax is imposed by central bankers who answer to no one, who set policy in closed meetings, and who openly state their intention to reduce your money's value by 2% annually while claiming this serves your interests. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but inflation never stops. And every day you hold dollars beyond immediate needs, every month you save in cash thinking you're building security, every year you trust that your government wouldn't deliberately destroy your wealth, you're paying the silent tax. The tax that never appears on any form, that extracts more than income tax from most families, that compounds silently over decades until retirement arrives and savings by a fraction of what you expected. The wealth being stolen isn't taken in a robbery or a scheme. It's taken through monetary policy, announced publicly, implemented openly, and imposed continuously on everyone too unsophisticated to understand that holding cash in an inflationary system isn't saving. It's slowly going broke by following advice that worked when money was real but became a trap the moment we switched to paper backed by nothing but promises from the people who profit from breaking them.